Well, we've heard a lot of compelling and unique stories about Quindaro. I want to tell you a story that unfolds a bit after Quindaro's role as a Freeport state. It's the story of Western University. It's been alluded to by a few other speakers. Quindaro was the first black school west of the Mississippi. If you go back to 1857, you can prove that, and up to about 1943. But being the first black school in the West is quite noteworthy. But what I also want to talk to you about is something that was also unique about Western University, is that its contributions to the musical arts of this country. While we talk about Western, I want to focus on the school's music programs and some of its most famous alumni. From the start, Quindaro's idealists addressed the educational needs of most of the white and the black children. The seed that was planted became Western was actually Freedmen's School or Freedmen's University. The Reverend Evan Blatchley, a Presbyterian minister, founded the school back in 1862 for the children of escaped and freed slaves, which tells you one thing, is that there were quite a few African Americans in Quindaro by the time of 1857 and 1862. They got there somehow. Blatchley's idea, courageous at the time, remember slavery was still illegal at this time, was that education encourages cultural, economic, and intellectual equality. Where the school began is still kind of unclear. There's one tradition that it actually began in the old brewery on the outside of Quindaro. This was also a place that was linked to the Underground Railroad. Quindaro resident Molly Lewis, however, she recalls in a 1934 interview that Blatchley School was somewhere under the hill down near the boat landing. She said, quote, that the colored children from all around the country came to this school. He was a teacher, a preacher, and we all loved him. Blatchley dreamed of building a campus, and he bought land for that purpose. But his health began to fail, and in 1877 he died. But the dream did not die with him. Corvine Patterson, who was a Baptist deacon and a community leader in Quindaro, Kansas City, Kansas area, approached first the Baptists about carrying on Blatchley School, and when nothing happened there, he went to the AME Church. And in 1880, on Patterson's front porch, a deal was struck. The AME Church already saw education as a way to advance the cause of the people that were only about 20 years distance from the shackles of slavery. And in 1881, the conference voted to found Western University, stating that it had worked out a very good deal to purchase 133 acres of land up on the bluff looking down the old Quindaro site. The AME bishops agreed that it's a religious duty to educate. According to their Kansas conference in 1881, they said, the thousands of our people already in this young and growing state of Kansas, the thousands of refugees constantly fleeing to us from southern injustice, remind us that the field is white and ready for harvest. The wave of blacks into Kansas continued up through 1890. In fact, about 19,000 of these young blacks were of school age. Of those, only 375 attended secondary school, and only 13 had advanced to a higher education. Western's curriculum was based on the Booker T. Washington model, that vocational training was just as important as academic training in helping the African American to reach an economic foothold. The school's first full-time president, William Tecumseh Vernon, a 25-year-old AME minister, personified this goal. In 1902, Vernon, who was a resident of Lebanon, Missouri, and his parents had been slaves, was quoted in the Topeka Daily Capital touting vocational education. He said, "Teach the Negro a trade, and the commercial opportunity will follow. Every pupil in this school, unless of ill health prevents it, must put in half the time learning a trade. Maybe there's a chance for another Tuskegee here." Vernon expanded Western's curriculum in recognition He was also an astute politician, and he worked his way up within the Republican Party in Kansas, which was a different Republican Party than we have now, by the way, and also nationally. So that in 1899, in return for Vernon's help in gaining black support for his 1898 election, Governor William F. Stanley pressed the legislature to award Western $10,000 to build its second building, and this was Stanley Hall. Stanley Hall being the building right here with the cars in front of it, and over here is what the university looked like after a number of other buildings were built. It was Ward Hall, Stanley Hall, and Grant Hall, and then there was 2 dormitories, and there was also some buildings for the vocational training. From that time on, Western, until 1933, was a combination. The state and the AME Church both operated Western. The church retained the right, though, to choose the president of the school, who would preside over both the vocational side and the academic side. A talented speaker, Vernon gained national fame and went on to become a speaker all over the nation. And in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt asked him to register, or appointed him to be Register of the United States Treasury. Register of the United States Treasury. Vernon then became an AME bishop, and he also served in South Africa. Western's dual approach to education can be seen in its courses. On the vocational side, women learn sewing, cooking, typing, accounting, and boys learn things such as cabinet making, printing, tailoring, blacksmithing, farming, and mechanical drawing. But on the academic side, students were also required to learn English, algebra, business, literature, and languages. And there was music, with recitals, competitions, concerts. Music was, in fact, the most popular subject at the school. At one point, nearly half of the students were enrolled in music courses, which were either orchestration, or voice, or piano, or theory. And as you can see here, if you look closely, you can see that there is the chorus in the back and the band in the middle. I don't know who all the young men are. They're not all young, by the way, but all the women are seated and the men are standing. I don't know if that's still practice that goes on today, but it's rather unique. Yes. In his book, The Rise and Fall of Western University, historian Orrin McKinley Murray wrote that the music department was the outstanding department of the school that contributed more to the development of the school than did any other department. It's not really surprising, though, because music had long played a role in sustaining African Americans through slavery, which, you always have to remember that this was only 30 years distant from when there was slavery in Missouri and even in portions of Kansas. In a system of bondage, where every movement is controlled, where access to education, religion, and the larger world was limited or denied, music often was the only way that slaves could express the one thing that couldn't be controlled, which was their thoughts. Slave songs, which became known as spirituals, expressed not only a belief in a better life in heaven, but a future victory over slavery, one that will come to those who stay steadfast in their faith. Gospel scholar Robert Garden wrote in his new book, Nothing But Love in God's Water. And then for the post-Reconstruction Black church, the spirituals evolved into an expression of current conditions, responses to economic pressures, along with a belief of a coming social change. White T. Walker, in his book, Somebody Calling My Name, writes that the African American church became the chief reservoir of black sacred music and the center of social change and liberation. Again, not surprising that spirituals became the soundtrack to the Civil Rights Movement. Most Americans have heard of the 5th Jubilee Singers, but I believe that many have not heard about the Jackson Jubilee Singers simply because of recognition. But the literature at museums and university libraries throughout the country, I've been to Iowa, Illinois, Chicago, Pittsburgh State, And there is a treasure trove of literature about Western's Jubilee Singers and also the graduates of Western that went on to become movers and shakers in the music industry. The person that was most responsible for the fame of Western's music department was its director, Robert G. Jackson, who's the fellow at the piano there. Under his direction, the music program grew from 42 students in 1903 to a peak of 153 students in 1911 out of a total school enrollment of 355 students. So nearly half the students were coming to Western University for its music. A few years ago, you mentioned Jesse Hope. I interviewed Jesse Hope about what happened to all these buildings at Western University, because if you go there now, they're not there at all. A Quindaro resident and a descendant of escaped slaves, Jesse told me that when he was a child, he played in the building where the music studio was. There were pianos on the top floor, there were pianos in the basement. And he said that the building was now dilapidated and that birds were nesting in the wreckage of the piano, still in the late 50s and early 60s. Jackson and Western may be best known for the Jackson Jubilee Singers. They toured the country back in the 1920s, performing at churches, concert halls, schools, and Chautauqua events, often with wildly appreciative audiences. Many reviewers considered them to be the nation's top touring group. Their programs included plantation ditties, spirituals, classical music, sacred music, choral music. And as you can see that they would travel around the country under the name of different groups. There could be 2 or 3 different Jackson Jubilee singing groups going around. The Jackson Jubilee Singers, Plantation Singers, and the Deep River Plantation Singers. This is a brochure from one of the Chautauqua events. This one's in Hooker, Oklahoma. The Chautauquas were sort of traveling tent shows that brought culture to smaller communities around the country. And the Charles Redpath Horner Lyceum of Chautauqua was one of the biggest in the country. And they had offices in Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, Detroit, and also in Kansas City at 30th and Troost. And that was the organization that promoted the Jackson Jubilee Singers from Western University. Again, a quote from Murray. "So great was their success in rendering spirituals and the advertising of the music department of Western University that the young people who had any kind of musical ambition decided to go to Western University of Quindaro." So check out this review from Montana, Havre, Montana Daily News. The review said, "The greatest Jubilee company in America to be here." Another newspaper review in Paducah, Kentucky. "Last night's program was conceded to be the best that has ever been in Paducah." And of course, if you've ever been in Paducah, those are strong words. I'm trying to get through here because I actually have some of the music. We actually found some of their music hidden on the internet, and nobody knew who they were. Sometimes, listening to LaDondra, I just realized, music is so much better sometimes than just seeing the written word. But being on the road was grueling, so I wanted you to see this. This is from information from letters that were written and from their itinerary. They would drive hundreds of miles, sometimes 300 or 400 miles overnight from one performance to the next, and then get on stage, perform, and go again. If you look closely, you can see what it probably can't see, but it says Notre Dame. And over here are the expenses that they had. The Chicago managers kept a really close attention on their expenses. I take it that the profits couldn't have been all that great, so they really watched them. So as these young people were on the road, they had to watch these expenses. Now, most of the time, they had to travel by car because getting booked on buses and trains and getting booked into rooming houses was a little bit difficult for African Americans at that time. So the Chautauqua people had to book these things often in advance. So when these young people were traveling around the country doing these hundreds of mile tours, often they were in cars, and often these cars would break down. flat tires, there were some accidents, an axle would break, and they would have to stop and they would have to fix these cars. So I want to talk quickly about a couple of the most famous alumni of Western University. Because not only is Western itself the institution as a training program, but the fruit of this school produced some of the best and most influential musicians in this country that changed the face of the music, film, stage, and performing arts industry in this country. I'm going to start with Edward Bochner. Edward Bochner studied voice and piano at Western and graduated in 1916. He was discovered by the great tenor Roland Hayes, who heard him singing in Kansas City, invited him to New York, and to be his protege. In 1919, Bochner was one of the first black Americans to ever record the new technology in the commercial recording industry. Between about 1914 and 1919, more African Americans began recording commercially. Before that time, it was mainly white groups. We've all heard about the Carter family and such, and I'm a big fan of them, of course. Bochner was accompanied by the great spiritual compiler. I don't know how many of you know Harry T. Burleigh, but he was one of the greatest compilers of spiritual music in the country. And he sang, "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," and it was one of the first black recordings. Bochner himself went on to produce musical plays, operas, and articles. He headed the musical departments at Samuel Houston College and Wiley College of Texas. His love of the spirituals led him to arrange and publish nearly 300 spirituals in collections, such as The Story of the Spiritual, where he gives a story of each spiritual, such as this one, Steal Away to Jesus, where he talks about how this was a signal that was given around to other slaves of a meeting that would perhaps be back in the woods or back in the swamp. It could be any kind of a meeting. Often they were religious meetings. This one he talks about, whenever the meeting was to be held, the leader would hum the first phrase of the spiritual, and some of the slaves would also then begin humming it to other slaves, and this gave a signal that everyone was to be notified. They would hum softly the good message all day, so that the slave master would never know what was going on. Pepa Jesse is a massive talent. She was a director, a writer, who produced a long list of firsts, opening doors for many other African Americans. She organized the Pepa Jesse choir after she left Western. She appeared in the first all-black musical film, Hallelujah, directing the chorus in that film. This was produced for MGM in 1929. She directed the music in the first production of George Gershwin's opera Porgy and Bess in 1935, and she stayed with that production right through 1967 in Europe. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. chose Jessie and her choir to be the official choir at the 1963 March on Washington. She was interviewed while she was an artist in residence at Pittsburgh State College in Pittsburgh, Kansas. She described how in her own hometown of Coffeyville, Kansas, that an education for an African American ended after elementary school, so she had nowhere to go. So her determined mother sent her to Western at the age of 13. In 1984, the Kansas Women in Communications named Jessie as one of the most important women in Kansas history. Etta Moten Barnett sang with the Jackson Jubilee Singers from 1916 to 1917. She then went on to fine arts at the University of Kansas, and after she graduated from the University of Kansas, she was invited by Jessie to go out to New York. Within 2 weeks of being in New York, she was hired to be in a Broadway play of The Fast and the Furious. Now, while Fast and the Furious did not last long on Broadway, it opened other parts to her, one of the most famous being The Gold Diggers of 1933, in which she sang My Forgotten Man. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's an old 1933 film with Joan Blondale. In My Forgotten Mail, what would strike you if you were back in 1933 seeing this beautiful contralto singing woman sitting in a windowsill talking about her man off the war? You would realize why this young woman at that time was hailed as the new Negro woman who was changing the face of film, because the role that she was playing was so different from the stereotypical menial roles that were given to African American women at the time. It was actually our own Kansas City Call that labeled her the new Negro woman. President Roosevelt was so taken by her singing that Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to sing at the White House, making her the first African American woman to perform at the White House. She later performed the Carioca, which was the Oscar-nominated film from the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movie, Flying Down to Rio. After she married Claude Barnett, who was the president of the Associated Negro Press, they traveled all over the world, going to Africa, giving lectures, which raised the whole issue of as Quindaro Taylor was talking the other night, the linkage between African American history in this country with Asia and with Africa, and how it's such a large piece of our history, not just here, not just in Quindaro, not just in Kansas, but throughout the world. But when she was asked about going to Western, here's what she said in an interview in 1997. John Brown had been on that ground, she said. He led some black soldiers across the river, and we could see from the girls' dormitory the wilderness, and we knew what history was there. Well, there's no evidence that Brown was ever in Quindaro. The sentiment that this spirit resided there was important to Barnett and every other graduate of that school, giving her a sense of the history and the inspiration that she kept with her, helping in her own success. The last alumni that I want to explore, there were others, but these are some of the finest, some of the ones that are just the most intriguing. Nora Douglas Holt, Douglas was her maiden name. In his book, Hot from Harlem, author Bill Reitz calls Nora Holt a Renaissance woman. Indeed, she was. In the 1920s, Holt was a glamorous socialite who was often in the headlines as much for her cabaret singing, partying, 5 marriages, as for her composing, musical criticism, for several newspapers, and her advocacy for black performers. In her article on pioneering musical women from Western, Helen Walker Hill writes of Holt that her long life contained enough tumult, contradictions, and accomplishments for several lifetimes. Langston Hughes called her the scintillating Negro blonde entertainer deluxe. She was the daughter of an AME elder in Kansas City who was also a trustee on Western. At 4, she was a prodigy on the piano. She graduated valedictorian. She went on to get the first master's degree in music by any African American when she went to the Chicago School of Music. And in her young life, she composed over nearly 200 classical pieces and compositions. Unfortunately, nearly every one of them was stolen or lost while she was traveling in Europe. The only one that truly can be found now and still can be produced is this one right here. And there's a copy if you want to look at it. It's over here on the table if you want to thumb through it if you're musically inclined. Negro Dance. It has kind of a classical but sort of a ragtime rhythm to it. She's also known for helping to found the National Association of Negro Musicians, the oldest organization dedicated to preserving, encouraging, and advocating for all genres of African American music. Now, as these young people, as their talents and their careers were ascending with success, the foundations were slipping under Western for a variety of reasons. After 1929, with the Depression, there was less money. Fewer parents had money to send their kids to Western. and the joint relationship between the state and the AME Church, this joint operation of the school became very political with a lot of outside political pressure. And there came to be a schism that ended up in sort of a divorce between the state and the AME Church in 1933, and the AME Church withdrew. Vernon returned to Western for a period of time for 2 or 3 years, and actually the university began to grow again, but that reversal, when he stepped down in 1936, reversed itself, and the school began to lose population, enrollment. The buildings began to fall into disrepair, and in the last graduating class in 1943, there were only 6 graduating students. Robert Jackson himself died in 1929 while the Jackson Jubilee Singers were on tour performing. Legislators in 1943 voted to combine Western with the vocational school in Topeka, and the school closed. Some of the school's proud buildings burned down, others were demolished. For a time, Douglas Hospital, which is moved into Grant Hall, which was the women's dormitory, operated until about 1978. But then it closed, and as you can see, it was demolished. This is the theme song, O Western You. But while the physical structures of Western no longer stand, it is vital that the school's history and legacy live on. And one way to do this is to look beyond the mere physical, those are the actual buildings, to celebrate the lives and the contributions of all of these remarkable and talented young people who received a creative spark at Western. A spark that allowed them to succeed despite cultural barriers, and to more than succeed, to change the larger culture for the better. This is the legacy of Western University, and it's an irreplaceable chapter in the story of the rise of African Americans. And there is a lesson here for all of us. While all else may seem to be gone, the music remains, and the music is a gift to a nation that should feel grateful. I don't know if I got any time to do at least one song from Jackson Jubilee Singers. I would think it would be the first one. Oh no, this is Edinburgh.
Which one did you want?
Oh, that's fine. Play that one first. We'll just play a few seconds for each. This is at a mountain in Gold Diggers of 1933. This blew everybody away. Okay. This was recorded in 1918. This is Edward Boatner. Harry T. Burley is playing on the piano. It's in New York. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what they refer to as the Jubilee style, singing some of these old spirituals, which was operatic and voicing. Yeah, it's good. No, this is the Jackson Jubilee Singers. This is about 1932. This is a precursor also to the Black Barbershop Quartets that became the gospel quartets, like the Hummingbirds and some of the others that you're all familiar with. Well, I think I'm going to stop there with the music, but I just wanted to give you a taste of what brilliant talent came out of this school. And when you go out there tomorrow, look for it. You're not going to see it, but the memory is there and the music remains. Thank you very much.